Welcome to the fifth conversation in the Reconstructing Children's Rights Institute. Today's conversation is entitled Confronting Paternalism, Neo-Colonialism, and Racism in the Design and Implementation of Child and Family Programs in Humanitarian and Development Settings. Our speakers today are Tina Hyder and Zarlasht Halaimzai. Tina Hyder is the Executive Director of Refugee Trauma Initiative. She was formerly Deputy Director of the Early Childhood Program of the Open Society Foundations based in London. As Deputy Director, Tina helped forge partnerships to strengthen early childhood policies, research networks, and programs for young children and their families. Prior to joining the Open Society Foundations, Tina was a global advisor for Save the Children UK, supporting more than 50 country offices around the world to promote the rights of children affected by discrimination. Her earlier work includes programming for children affected by conflict and other emergencies. Zarlasht Halaimzai, the CEO and co-founder of the Refugee Trauma Initiative, co-founded this initiative in 2016 after returning from the Syrian border, where she had advised international NGOs on education and child well-being to help refugees dealing with the emotional fallout of violence and displacement. She has worked for several aid organizations, including Save the Children. In the UK, she has worked for the Young Foundation, the Studio Schools Trust, and the Skills Lab, an education consultancy where she was a founding director. In 2018, Zarlasht was selected as a fellow of the inaugural class of Obama Fellows, a group of 20 global leaders in civic innovation. Zarlasht and her family were forcibly displaced from Kabul when she was 11 years old. She arrived in the UK at age 15 and was granted asylum. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you discuss how programs for children and parents can, in some cases, demonstrate evidence of paternalistic, colonial, neocolonial, or racist norms and tendencies?
When I think about how programs around the world can be paternalistic, racist, and colonial, I start thinking about my own experience as someone who was displaced and was in need of protection, and also someone who's been working to support displaced and disenfranchised communities throughout my career. I come from a community and a culture where child rearing is very communal, it's very interdependent, and the experience of childhood and child development is very much reliant on matriarchal structures, where mothers and grandmothers play a really significant role in children's education, social and emotional learning, and development of values that children may carry for the rest of their lives. Women share responsibility and caregiving to the point where children can have several caregivers aside from their mother and father, and where family boundaries and the way that we understand the nuclear family in Europe and North America are often blurred. Immediate families that people live with can include grandparents and uncles and aunts and cousins, and sometimes even people that aren't even related that aren't related to the family and can be adopted and who become really close member of another family. Resources are shared, skills are shared and exchanged, and there is a sense of collective ownership, which creates safety and belonging, and both experience of happiness and progress and grief and adversity are collective. People come together, for example, to organize a wedding or a funeral, or when somebody falls ill. And this is a conservative community, right? I'm Afghan. I grew up in the context of Afghan culture, where women have very few public roles, but they have a certain level of agency and power in their own homes. So there is this private space where women can exercise their power. When I was growing up, I could see how this community around me created protection, extremely difficult circumstances, where experience of adversity is very common because of the war in Afghanistan. And as a practitioner, I can see how protective this collective approach was for me and my sibling. Sharing responsibility, for example, and having more than one adult that provides that invaluable shielding for a child is super important when there's a possibility that you can be separated, or your parents, or your parents can be killed. That's a, incredibly important way to keep children safe. And if you juxtapose this experience against some of the programs that are run globally, you can begin to see the differences, right? Where the concept of nuclear family is imposed on communities that are essentially collective, where women are rendered powerless, so women are depicted as these, totally powerless people and their own lives, and misses the kind of the solidarity and the bonds that women create in those kind of societies to protect themselves and their children. And we're isolating families in the way that, the Western paradigm of nuclear family suggests can be really dangerous. And I've seen, so many examples where the circumstances of parents and caregivers of certain backgrounds, like, race and gender or sociopolitical class, or, just the fact that they're stuck in the context of conflict or displacement, are used against them. And they're held responsible for factors that are totally external to them. And that factors that affect their capacity as parents and caregivers. And I think, one of the things that I find problematic is this concept of parenting programs where parents are taught skills, and which totally misses the sort of the community dynamics and the external circumstances, but instead lectures parents on how they can, develop parenting skills that may not be appropriate for their context or their circumstance. And I think the one of the biggest things that I actually find really perturbing is this idea that parents from certain parts of the world aren't allowed any kind of contact. So they held responsible on certain things without paying attention to what might be going around them. So one of the things I hear often from people working in the refugee context is, how can parents put their children on a boat and bring them, and risk their lives? And that which totally misses this pressure that parents are under and the choices they're having to make to keep their children safe. So that's some of the things that I've experienced and seen, both as someone who went through this experience, but also someone who works in the context of displacement.
Thank you, Zarlasht. A lot to unpack there, and we'll return to some of these ideas, which also resonate with what some of our other speakers have highlighted as well. So thank you for that. Tina, would you add anything?
I suppose my starting point is that the whole sector of child development, and specifically from my own experience, early childhood development and programming for very young children and their parents, is impacted by paternalism. And we can see that in the way that it is funded, in the way that it is prioritized by organizations who fund work globally. And we know, and this is demonstrated by things such as the sort of funding levels. So we know that early education programs constitute only about 1% to 2% of education development funding as a whole. And that's despite all the evidence we have from multiple sectors about its benefits for children, for families, and actually just as importantly for communities. So we see the whole field itself, early childhood development, as a subsector of education, health, protection, nutrition. And to me, it really does demonstrate the kind of patriarchal, paternalistic roots that really, I think, inform the whole discourse on the care of children. And what we see is a very feminized and overlooked domain, which the state does not step into unless it has to, and which is left to individuals or to communities to manage, and is viewed as women's work and therefore lacking in status and political interest. And I think this is an ongoing fight. And I think very much, as Zarlasht has already mentioned, if we look around the world, actually when programming does take place, we do see a set of assumptions that frame those interventions, specifically around the need to improve parents and parenting skills. And that there's a need to find resources, interventions, packages from outside communities to help families optimize their children's development. I think this is a legacy of colonialism still, where we see the language, the ways of working as being following very old patterns of colonial flow of power and control. And it's often poor communities of color around the world who are subjects, literally, of these sets of interventions, these ways of working, these ways of thinking. And I think this sort of thinking also informs the way we conceptualize childhood and what's seen as an ideal or as an appropriate childhood. And I think some of those conceptualizations bear very little resemblance to the lives of children in many parts of the world, where, for instance, young children contributing to a household economy is the norm. And this is not about exploitative child labour. It is about communities and families working together and children's capacities being acknowledged and built into and absorbed within the way that a family operates. And again, as Zarlasht has said, the sort of the rhetoric around some that informs, though it might not be explicit, but informs some parenting interventions. It's about, there's a subtext of children don't play with our parents don't play with their children sufficiently, they don't interact with them, they don't read to them in an appropriate way. And I think this really indicates where sometimes the work that happens within the wider development space and the humanitarian space is about addressing symptoms and not root causes. And when we look at external pressures that are linked to capitalism, globalism, where people find themselves with erratic incomes and livelihoods, basic services that are hardly adequate if they do exist, weak political systems, poor accountability, these are the issues I feel that we need to address before we start to blame individuals for not parenting in a particular way that we think is appropriate.
Your focus on that, Tina, reminds me of a very brilliant article called Protecting Children, Blaming Parents that some colleagues of ours in Indonesia did, that really looks at the way that a neoliberal economy has really increased the pressures on parents to produce and to be productive members of society while removing the supports available to them and simultaneously blaming them for outcomes in children. I want to return to a few things that I heard in both of your opening discussions there. The first, Zarlasht, is that you mentioned that you think it's dangerous to consider parents and families as isolated from their broader community networks. And I'd love to hear more from both of you. What are the dangers of these conceptualizations of families in isolation from their broader contexts?
So I think the dangers are that the interventions, the programming that is designed often elsewhere, that's then imposed from a great distance, does just not fit. It doesn't build on strengths and capacities that communities possess because of the collective nature of the way that most parts of the world operate in terms of kinship and families. And therefore, those programs don't work. I mean, whatever the optimal outcome is intended to be, by not building on strengths, but building on deficits instead, I think they're almost destined to fail.
So some of the things that are deemed as problematic around the world and how communities protect themselves and the children actually support and create safety. So, for example, children's contributions economically to a family, or the fact that caregiving is shared amongst many adults, or this whole idea of women being totally powerless in their own community. So Afghan women are a really good example of that. The representation and the way that Afghan women are talked about is very much as totally powerless, as totally powerless in their own community. And that's just not true. Of course, they have, vulnerabilities within that country, but within that structure, there are places where women exercise power. And so when you start to chip away at some of these things that actually keep children and family, you expose them to further vulnerability. And I think a very common practice, as Tina said before, within, development and humanitarian aid is to look at a child and parents in isolation from all the things that are going around them, from other members of their family, from their community, and that can push an idea and impose an idea that's actually harms children and their family. And I would just add one more thing. Again, as what's going on with Afghanistan is a really good example, where for 20 years, there has been countless of children and family programs that have talked about parenting and sought to kind of help parents better protect their children, whilst missing the larger political context where the countries that are intervening or involved in Afghanistan are actually, that's the thing that's making children unsafe. It's the violence, and that violence has a political cause, and that parents and families have very, very, very little to do and are totally powerless in that circumstance. The biggest thing that is currently a danger to Afghan children and families is what's going on politically, and the empowerment of certain forces in Afghanistan, and the fact that the intervention there has not only improved the country but is actually destabilizing it again. So that's the thing that is causing the most amount of harm, and that's totally omitted from any kind of discussion of how we should protect kids.
Absolutely. And thank you for reminding our listeners of that important overarching reality that influences people's lives far more than parents' inability or perceived inability to care for their children. Another thing that you both alluded to that I found very interesting was the idea that these programs may in fact be rendering women powerless by conceiving them as powerless, and that this is a feminized space that does not actually acknowledge women's important roles in family and community life. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
I'll give you the example of how I was brought up, which I think might help illuminate some of this. So even in a society as conservative as Afghan society, women have spaces or pockets of power within their own community and society. And one way that that's done is that women very much make decisions within the home and the private space. So they're in charge of educating their children, they're in charge of transmitting history and identity, they're in charge of teaching values. Islam, if, for example, I was taught Islam through my grandmother, and, a woman who didn't actually, she was illiterate, but the way that she taught Islam was very much about highlighting the kind of values that underpin Islam. That's quite a lot of power that women have when it comes to their community, because they're able to shape the development of their children, the identities of their children, how they will interact, and kind of be in society in the future. And that's totally kind of not seen by a lot of, by aid agencies and development agencies. So I very rarely heard people talk about how, the power dynamics, as it both renders women powerless, but also power dynamics that gives women power. The complexity is not there. And I think that, that kind of strips people of agency. And if you're a child who is participating in one of these programs and you see your mother or, women in your community represented in that way, I think that can have quite a profound impact on how you begin to see yourself if you're a little girl, and the way that you will develop your identity around motherhood and being a woman in these kind of communities.
I'd add to that. I think exactly as Zarlasht says, the complexity, the multiple identities that people adopt within the spaces that we all operate in day to day are not acknowledged in programming and in funding and in the way that we conceptualize programs for children. And I see a number of things. I see the power of bringing up children in a community is just not acknowledged. It's not acknowledged, as I said earlier, in funding. It's not acknowledged in terms of how programs, organizations prioritize investments in children and families, and the power that women have to bring up the next generation, to inform, to imbue values, to support and reinforce identity. It is not acknowledged, and I think we miss huge opportunities by not seeing how powerful women can be within those spaces. And I also see from a very practical point of view, the status that women gain when they start to work and are recognized externally in those early childhood spaces. Young women from communities who are not valued in terms of perhaps what their educational achievements to date, but who then come into a space and start to acquire knowledge, work in a way where the community more broadly sees the value of that engagement with children, I think is phenomenal. And again, it is something that is overlooked often as a secondary impact of the way that some programs work. And then another thing I'd mention is the role of men within all of this. Where are men within sometimes the actual direct service delivery of our work with much younger children and families? Where is the role of fathers and the space that fathers need and should have within the spaces when we're thinking about future generations, and actually challenging some of the damaging gender norms that imbue all of society, the sort of patriarchy that's continued, but then start to counter some of that and think about the breadth of roles and identities that we can all adopt. So I think we just miss the space by keep putting people in. Women are powerless in this space, in this community, and they do this, and men belong over here, even though we might want to bring them over there. We might talk about it, but we don't do very much always. I think I'm saying we as someone who's worked in development for a long time.
Yes, I'm actually reviewing some parenting materials right now. And what's interesting to me is that there is a nod to gender at the very beginning and the importance for gender inclusive facilitation, etc. But the conceptualization of the complexity of gender is not then kind of seeping throughout the entire product. And I think that is all going to be very contextual, but both of you have highlighted that, people who are not from these communities are almost certainly going to miss a lot of the complexity. Tina, you also referred to prepackaged or ready-made parenting programs. And there certainly is a literature that argues for the transportation of programs from one place to another. And I agree with you that I find that approach highly problematic. And it's not only going to miss local complexity and relevance, but also, as you've both said so clearly, potentially be harmful. You are at Refugee Trauma Initiative designing new ways of working in this space. And I would love to hear from both of you as we move forward to reconstruct our approaches to working with children, families, and communities. How can you use programs to dismantle the paternalism, the neocolonialism, the racism that you have witnessed? How can programming decolonize and reconstruct children's rights, child protection, and family programs?
The first step to constructing programs that meet families and children and communities as they are is to really interrogate our own assumptions about the communities that we're working in. So the organization that I set up, Refugee Trauma Initiative, one of the main reasons why I decided to set up something myself was because I felt that the level of understanding, the contextual understanding around why parents and children are, behave in a certain way, how they interact or negotiate their circumstances, is that complexity is missed. And one of the most kind of fundamental things for us is to recognize and acknowledge the stress and the pain that people are feeling when they are going through something like a war in Afghanistan or a war in Syria, and they're making the decision to leave. When I was growing up, one of the things that I was hyper aware of is how what was happening to me and my family coming from Afghanistan didn't seem to count as much as some of the, when people were reporting similar situations or, an experience of violence, let's say in the UK, just didn't seem to match somehow. And so what we try to do at RTI is to really, first of all, begin from the perspective that people come with all kinds of experiences, and those experiences can have, multiple impacts on them and their children, and that there is both stress and adversity present in families, but there's also resilience and strengths and ways that families work together to keep themselves safe. So that would be my first point, is to interrogate the assumptions. Where are we coming from? How does, your experience of childhood or my experience of childhood interact with what we do? There's a kind of a particular set of skills that parents need to demonstrate all the time, instead of thinking that complex situations, and actually I would say, all parents can experience different levels of complexity, but that requires, a massive array of kind of values, skills, ways of dealing with things, which, prepackaged kind of programs and which will have prepackaged conceptions, don't meet and don't support where parents are, doesn't meet where parents are.
And to continue on that, I think that first point about refugee leadership and leadership from communities in general who are partners or are working alongside agencies who are probably very well-meaning, but I think that notion of partnership and the practice of partnership is incredibly important. So for the Refugee Trauma Initiative, that translates into the facilitators who deliver some of the childcare and early childhood development services in the communities in which they're working are from the refugee community. And and sometimes that's a really important shift for other agencies whom we're working with to actually see leadership can come and it can be generated from the community itself. The community are not helpless and vulnerable all the time. Like most of us, they have a range of skills and capacities that are either stronger or less strong depending on context, environment. So refugee leadership, I think, and leadership from the communities that we engage with is absolutely essential. And I think it's important that reflects in the staff teams of some of the agencies, the child rights, humanitarian development agencies who deliver these programs. I think there is a change in the way that people engage, the language that's used when people, the communities are on both sides of the table, are not just of the communities, but actually are thinking about engaging and structuring these interventions. I think there's something about the space and the time to reflect on our own assumptions, our own understanding and experiences of racism, sexism, the other areas where we struggle as individuals within our own experiences, where we all need to do work. I think the space and time to do that, as happens in RTI, is really important. We all operate with masses of assumptions and they're not right all the time. And it's really important that work doesn't stop. We continue to make the space and value those times where we are self-critical, but we support each other as well to think and extend our think and extend the way that we see the world. Engaging politically. I don't think, again, because the children's spaces are often seen as so depoliticized, they are some of the most politically active spaces that I think you can work in, where when communities are investing in the future and their children, there is a space for change, there's a capacity for change there, and not just to campaign and advocate on behalf of people, but with people, communities describing their experiences and describing the changes they want to see. And again, that's something that's very integral to the way RTI operates. And the final thing I'd mention is evidence. It's what we see, what we value in terms of what works. Sometimes a randomized control trial is not appropriate as a way of demonstrating the efficacy of a particular intervention, of a way of working with the community. Let's find other ways to actually show what works without imposing something that might fit very well in a very nice, calm, stable community with a particular population, but doesn't work for everyone and everywhere.
Again, a lot to unpack, and I thank you for your rich observations. I just want to return to a few of the themes and ideas that you mentioned. And the first is around, I'm going to move backwards, the political engagement piece. We've heard throughout this session that the political realities, especially structural and political violence, can be extreme stressors and realities that undermine parents' capacities and families and communities in general. Is there a way to design programs which can seem very individualized or reaching one specific family or community that also includes the political engagement that you're talking about, or in some ways at least acknowledges and addresses that? Or are these two separate spheres? The programming and the family supports and the community supports and the political engagement?
I don't think they have to be separate spheres, and I think there are examples of programming around early childhood development where the engagement in transformation within a community leads to other transformations, people holding decision makers to account for more investment, for better services, because that community itself has demonstrated that it is possible to create spaces for children that are positive, but that are determined in their own terms. So I think there is potential there for the two to be, for that social action, whatever you want to call it, political activity, but where people who don't have agency in many spaces have agency because they have made that difference to their children. They've organized the service, they've figured out a way to leverage resources, they've worked with agencies and created a space that maybe wasn't there before for the children in their community.
I would add to that in saying that, before we can even start talking about the design of particular programs in this space, we need to talk about how we the language that we use to describe child development in the first place. So the way that we talk about child development is as if it happens in a vacuum away from the politics, and it doesn't, right? So in the case of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh or places where they've been displaced, that's happening because of a genocide. Or in the case of Afghans, being displaced, that's happening because there has been a protracted conflict in which many, many countries around the world have been involved over the last 4 decades. So it's kind of impossible to think about, child development and those kind of contexts away from the politics, right? Because children, like I said before, the number one reason why children are harmed in a context like Afghanistan is because of political violence, and that's included, violence perpetrated by the Afghan militias like the Taliban and various other militias, and it includes violence from places like American occupation of Afghanistan, or the NATO soldiers being present in Afghanistan. That's what's harming kids. So it's kind of difficult to think about programming design when we don't even talk about that in the early childhood space. Like, what is actually preventing children from thrive and reach their potential, which is the phrase I hear very, very often in this space. It's violence, it's political violence. So we need to begin to have a discussion about, how we as a community of practitioners and advocates in the early childhood spaces can even begin to acknowledge that that's something that's happening. And that is the main reason why children are being displaced, why they are harmed, why they experience violence. I would love to kind of get to a place where we can marry all these different places, diplomacy and early childhood and all peacemaking, all of these things are interconnected and intersect. And how can we find the language to talk about these in a way, in a way that acknowledges that interconnectedness.
Thank you for highlighting political violence, which is something that we speak so all too rarely about in the field of child protection and children's rights. And for those listeners or viewers who have watched a few of these, I think what you are saying really connects very, very profoundly with some of our speakers in our first and our second conversations, especially, who are just reminding us that we can't really have the conversation about, for example, program design before we have acknowledged the backdrop, or the foreground really, but the political realities that our programs are embedded in and that we're trying to design programs in. One more theme that you both referred to that really struck me was this notion of not just refugee leadership, but resilience that comes from within families and communities. And I think what is difficult for me is that most agencies have adopted a language of being assets-based, of looking for resilience in community, of building their programs on pre-existing assets. Even that language of pre-existing thinks of the moment of arrival of the agency as the starting point, and the pre-existing is what came before them. So there has been a co-optation of the language, but I think still programs look very much like the skills, the attempts to transfer skills that you described before, especially parenting skills that assume that some people are not good parents or are weakened in their capacity to care for their children. What does it mean to really take an assets-based or a resilience approach to this work, and how have you done it?
I think it's a really good question, and I think it really counters the trend of the way that many agencies work, and that's about time and resources. It's about knowing communities. It's not appearing from somewhere, which many agencies are. It is much, and it also links to funding. It is much easier to fund a package. There's 20 interventions over this period leading to this outcome, and this is transferable around the world. But actually the piece that is going to make something work and not be a transitory experience that may or may not change an attitude or behavior or knowledge is time. It's time and a community themselves describing what it is as important to them in terms of what helps them, what would help them support the raising of their children, notwithstanding the kind of political, social, economic environments that many families find themselves in, which is often beyond the range of the programs that we develop. But it's also about partnerships then. It's about joined up programming, so that maybe a program for children is linked to a program that looks at income generation, that looks at sort of wider skills development. And again, this is all about the language of there is a deficit and let us come and fill it for you. But there is something about genuine opportunities that are based on what communities themselves are telling us and not what somebody else from the outside is saying would be useful.
A big part of designing programs that acknowledges the assets of both people. So in our context, it's refugees that arrive in Greece, and both and the local Greek community, is to trust them, to bring them to the program design and development in the first place, is to kind of trust that they know how to manage the problems in their communities much better than external agencies that come for a short period of time and then, and kind of parachute these prepackaged programs. So one thing that we've done is ensure that at every stage of the program development, we have either people who are employed, or if we, in the beginning when RTI started 5.5 years ago, when we didn't have the resources to make sure that everybody was that we could employ as many people as possible, that make sure that parents were present, making sure that, people from the Greek community are present when we're actually conceiving of a program design in the first place, and that their views and their knowledge and their wisdom is harnessed through the program design. Like Tina said, it takes time, but if we're talking about changing structural issues, that's what's necessary. It's not, that doesn't happen overnight. You actually need to invest time and resources, and you have to see it as a step rather than you changing the entire structure, but it's a step that you're contributing to, and that structural change. The way that you described so well how the language of resilience and co-opted, there's so many contradictions in the way that we describe resilience in this space, because on the one hand, we don't want to acknowledge the trauma that people have been through. We don't want to we want to say these people have pre-existing assets, which to me is just such a strange way to describe people and the human experience, as if you kind of step from one Excel sheet to another. It's just strange to describe human experience in that way. And instead of doing on the one hand we do that, and on the other hand, if you look at the way that staffing is structured, if you look at the way that how people who hold power in these spaces are structured, they very rarely include people that come from the communities that are affected by this. So on the one hand, we say they're super resilient, they don't get affected by trauma. And on the other hand, we're like, well, but also, they're not really capable of managing their own problems. They're not really capable of real leadership. We trust them with the resources and with the funding and with the advice that is possible for them to make their own decisions around programming. So it's this weird contradiction that happens in the way that we talk about programming.
And I think that contradiction you're referring to reveals some unresolved inconsistencies in the ways that we are approaching this work. And I hope that we can keep moving in a more appropriate direction. I really appreciate hearing from you about, thinking about what smaller contribution are we making to structural change, because systemic change and structural change can be very overwhelming. And if we are trying to dismantle a system, thinking about that whole facade disappearing can be quite, I think, overwhelming for some people. But thinking about what steps we take towards healthier ways of working is a really helpful reminder. I also really appreciated the emphasis on trust, which I do think is just a really crucial factor that does not really imbue the way that we talk about our programs. Do we talk about a trusting foundational relationship between the supporting organization and the families and communities that they are working with? Not typically, but I think that notion of trust is really, really fundamental, something that programs can't be effective without. And I think learning how to foster that and encourage it is really going to be a crucial step forward. You have already spoken to this. This is our last question, but I do want to ask it outright. There are renewed discussions underway right now about the future of humanitarian and development aid. Whose vision and whose framing should we be privileging as we reimagine this? Whose voices and perspectives should we be prioritizing when we think about how to design and implement programs? And as you think about that, please comment on how we ensure that the people whose perspectives you think should be privileged how could this actually happen?
I've been reflecting a lot on the Refugee Convention recently, because the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention is coming up next week. And I was reading about how it's structured and it's framed, and thinking about what could we do to kind of get renewed support for this framework. But one thing that struck me when I was going through it is how state-centered it is. So it doesn't actually talk to the experience of people who are displaced. It's very much for the signatories to, it's designed for the signatories to feel comfortable, rather than kind of acknowledge the refugee experience and, how people are displaced and kind of create a paradigm where you can actually hold states that experience refugee flows accountable for how they treat people who come to their, to their domain for asylum. And I think the same is true of aid and development. I think the perspective of people that needs to be, central to program design and shifting that paradigm is people who use the services, people who are in need of humanitarian protection, and they will, they know what that experience is like, how, the kind of things that they need. And they actually support, they're the ones who actually manage these crises. Humanitarian aid agencies don't stay with the countries forever. They go in, come out, go in, come out. And so it's the communities themselves that actually manage emergencies and they deal with the fallout. So their perspective, I think, is crucial. I think it's, I'm often asked, like, how do you do the, what's the best way to address poverty? And my answer is always like the simplest kind of answer, which seems, too simple in a way, is the right one. The way to support people who are poor is to give them money. It's to make sure that they have the resources to be able to support their families. And that's supported by evidence. If you look at, how cash programs support communities, that's what it says. It's like, if you give communities the resources to manage their problems, they often make the best choices for themselves. So for my own personal experience, when my parents were going through these, really extraordinary, difficult circumstances, my mother managed to make sure that we had healthy meals all the time, no matter how little money we had, because she's the person who cared the most about her kids. And I'll give you one example. We talked about trust before, and I'll give you one example of how this is demonstrated, the lack of it is demonstrated within program design. So in Greece, we run, we try to create spaces with communities where parents can make decisions about the programming that they want to have and create their own structures for support. And we were trying to convince a larger aid agency to adopt some of the approaches that we employ in our programming. So allow mothers, for example, to run groups for their kids. And one of the barriers to them adopting our approach was, how can, the question that I was asked is, how can we ensure safeguarding? How can we make sure that, the children are safe within this group, right? And this is in a context where the sort of the safeguarding structures that, for example, in the UK, that exist in the UK, don't exist. So in Greece, if you have a child protection, it's very often that nothing happens because there aren't resources available to deal with that child protection issue. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that struck me when they asked me that question is that the notion that, an external person will keep a child safer than their own mother, just to me seemed absurd, right? It's that it's mothers coming together and playing with their little kids, and they just want to have a space to do that. And we're doubting where, in that context, whether the mother can provide that sort of safety. And we need to kind of confront that and think about like what that means when we ask whether a mother can keep their child safe.
I appreciate your focus on the absurd, which is something that artists that we spoke with in our fourth conversation really highlighted, and they mentioned their kind of link to the Dada movement and surrealism. And there is a realm in which some of the questions we ask, can this mother care for her child, are surreal, especially when posed against the political backdrop that you mentioned. But I also loved the way that you rightly highlighted that the Refugee Convention is in many ways designed for the states who are signing it, but policies should in fact really be focused on the human impact that they have. And the global protection community really does depend quite heavily for its framings on international humanitarian law, especially to some degree international human rights law. But we should think about how people-centered these laws and bodies of law are, and really look for ways to humanize them.
I think, that notion of trust is central to any reimagining, I think, is incredibly important. And what that might mean in practice is valuing local organizations' local knowledge. And in practice, what that probably means is trust that happens at multiple levels, trust from organizations towards the local communities, but also the trust of funders to agencies the size of RTI and others, that we actually are engaging with communities, and that sometimes rather than fund a package, fund an approach that is about a human-centered form of design, that is about privileging the voices and the experiences of communities and the leadership of communities. And for me, that's really important to any kind of reimagining. As is also an examination of the vested interests of the industry, I'll call it. It's not a community. There's an industry that surrounds development and humanitarian structures. And I think we need to examine our values, our norms, our assumptions within those industries, and how we're self-perpetuating, and how sometimes the contradictions, the tensions, where the language is about empowerment, it's about capacity building, if we think that's a good thing, it is about a voice, a language of emancipation, and it does the exact opposite. It is about people maintaining their positions, their status, their jobs, and by maintaining and almost perpetuating a problem rather than actually looking at ways to do yourself and do oneself out of a job, which is a kind of ideal that many have. And another thing is that it's just acknowledging that the whole industry is not politically neutral, it's not economically neutral. Many aid and development and humanitarian budgets are linked to foreign policy agendas. And those foreign policy agendas, as Zarlasht has very clearly explained, are at the bottom of a great deal of the conflict, the unrest, the insecurity that so many populations experience, and is why so many people are on the move. But at the same time, those very governments blame those communities for being on the move. And the inherent contradictions within those dynamics, we have to start joining those pieces up and calling it out. And it's accountability at the end. It's the accountability that we have as a mid-sized small organisation to the people that we work with. It's the accountability funders have to the people who are donating money, to populations who are enabling governments to manage aid budgets. It's accountability and transparency that I think we sorely lack in many instances.
Thank you so much, Tina and Zarlasht. It has been another very thought-provoking, in a really deep sense. I think you are asking us to think very deeply about our place in the world and within an industry, as you have just highlighted, Tina. Hopefully, some of the viewers today will take to heart some of what you've said and join us in creating a movement for more equitable and trusting aid for families, communities, and children around the world. Thank you so much.